I do want to speak a little bit to investment implications. And I have a question. I was thinking of asking this of Stu, but I'm going to ask it of all three and see who would jump at this. The Greenland Resources stock has soared on the headlines. Critical Metals Corporation jumped 25%. Brian's note said there are more prudent places to turn, and these junior mining promoters are these junior mining promoters just riding a new news wave? And I'd love to get your take on it, guys. Whoever would like to jump in on that.
Well, let me start kind of bigger picture on investment implications. The way I'm looking at this is through the perspective of what, if anything, might this have to do with oil prices down the road? And I think there's really two implications. One is, does this fight, is part of the fight over concern that, like, if the U.S. doesn't, plant its flag on Greenland, somebody else will. And what if down the road there's another major oil discovery somewhere in that vicinity, and that oil that, in Trump's view, belongs to the U.S. now goes to somebody else. So from a perspective of, driving future supply, I think he has this vision that, it's a natural resource that we want to own, and maybe it's there, maybe it's not, but if it is, we should own it. The second piece is, I think, concern about on the oil demand side. If you look at global oil demand year to year and look at where the sources of that demand comes from, China is really in the pole position there. So, if the Chinese economy slows down, then that's not great for oil demand. That brings oil prices down. So if you're a populist president and you would like to have lower prices at the pump, and notwithstanding that it's not great for the U.S. as a net exporter, but be that as it may, at the pump prices would be lower, then throwing sand in the gears of the Chinese economy would be a plus, because all else being equal, that brings prices down. So I think those are the things that I'm looking at. We have to kind of assess how quickly is the Chinese economy growing. It's been kind of underwhelming last, year and a half. So, and oil prices are, struggling to stay above $60 a barrel, despite all the geopolitical headlines that we see.
Anybody have any thoughts?
I do find it interesting that, sorry, Frank. I was just going to say, I find it interesting because in metals and mining, copper and aluminum are aluminum's at multi-year highs, copper's at all-time highs. Obviously, gold and silver trade all-time highs for other reasons. But when we're looking at China as a consumer, they are a big driver of metals demand. And we're seeing a lot of commodities that are tied to that really hitting, historic highs. And some of that's due to supply issues, but obviously demand is very high. So it is interesting, the point that you make about oils too on China.
Hey, I want to ask this of Brian and Matt. If you're looking at critical minerals over a 10-year horizon, what names make sense?
MP Materials makes a ton of sense. We have a strong buy on MP Materials, and we have for a while. And I think that the partnership with the DoD, partnership that it has with private companies, is really backstopping a lot of that demand. And they're really bringing the whole supply chain of powerful rare earth magnets back to the U.S. And so that, they're going to have a lot of demand for companies that want a secure supply chain. And so that's really for rare earths. It's Linus Materials is another one. We don't cover Linus, but I know that that's another one that's sort of mentioned in the same breath as MP Materials.
Yeah, Frank, MP Materials and Linus are companies that we've spoken of. I think that there's a million little mines and a million penny stocks in this industry. And in the end of the day, I think your global giants are still going to somehow be able to usurp those and bring them under their umbrella. And those would be like BHP, Rio, even Canadian mid-sized ones like Ivanhoe. Those are the big companies that are going to be eventually driving the bus, so to speak. In the meantime, there's a lot of small stocks out there.
I'm just going to go
kind of sad.
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to say it's kind of sad too when BHP and Rio or Glencore, those big companies acquire, pure plays, and then it's harder for investors to gain exposure to it because BHP and Rio are still going to trade off iron ore prices because that's going to be their, the lion's share of their revenue and earnings. So it's always kind of sad when you see that some of the junior explorers or miners get acquired like that.
I will say that my view here is that I do think the clock runs out here on Trump and Greenland. I do think that this window of time that he has, I suspect that things will get dragged out, that he won't be able to do the things that he hopes for. I know on Capitol Hill, there was strong pushback from his own party on Greenland, saying, what are you doing? Why would you do this? And even some whispers that they might try to take legislative action to stop anything the president would try to do there. I do believe he won't stop. I just think the clock runs out on him. But if, say, for example, hypothetically, Matt, the tariffs are back on and we're seeing real tension over Greenland again. Do you see this really strong growth period that we've seen in Europe, for example, among the defense companies? Do you see that just continuing at the current levels, or do you actually think that there's a point at which they could spike even further if we start to see that relation decay?
Well, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but I do think that European defense names in particular stand to benefit, and that growth rate could actually accelerate. Whereas I feel like a lot of the defense firms in the U.S., due to capacity constraints, are probably producing. We have seen sort of Trump push back on share buybacks and dividends, and really want the defense firms in the U.S. to increase capacity, and that will happen. I've seen it just in the defense names that have reported this week, and their tone on buybacks and dividends. I feel like that is going to happen, but it's harder for them to move the needle because they're already so large, and they already have pretty significant. A lot of them have pretty significant international exposure already. So I do think that if there's an escalation, like you said, with tariffs and sort of geopolitical tensions, the European defense names definitely stand to benefit more than the U.S. based names.
Yeah, I've got to agree with that.